Welcome, my friend. Before we begin, let me invite you to pause for a moment. Look around you. Where are you watching this video right now? Is it the comfort of your bedroom, the gentle flicker of a bedside lamp dancing on the walls? Or perhaps, you found this story in the early hours of dawn, the world outside just beginning to stir. Let me know in the comments, not just where you're tuning in, but the time you're listening to this. I wonder how this tale will shape your thoughts as you drift off tonight. Now, let's delve into our story. Story 1. Tonight, we unravel a life quietly lived yet abruptly interrupted, a life that belonged to someone whose name was whispered in shock, carried from one neighbor to another, and eventually echoed through the halls of a courtroom. That name was Sarah Whitley. Sarah was 29 years old, an unassuming schoolteacher in the small town of Millhaven. She wasn't famous, wasn't flashy, but she was beloved in her modest circle, a woman who smiled easily and whose days were marked by simplicity. She lived alone in a small bungalow on Pinewood Street, a street lined with weeping willow trees that swayed in the breeze, their long branches almost reaching down to touch the pavement. It was November, 1987, the kind of month that weighed heavy with the promise of winter. The days were shorter, the nights colder, and for Millhaven, rain seemed to be the constant companion. On the night of Sarah's disappearance, the town had been engulfed in one of those relentless autumn rains. You know the type, the kind where every corner of the world feels drenched and muted. Streetlights flickered, casting faint halos on the wet asphalt, while cars passed quietly, their tires whispering against the soaked roads. Sarah had spent her day much like she always did. Her last known movements were routine, finishing her lessons at Millhaven Elementary School, stopping at the grocery store on her way home, and settling in for an evening alone. She sent a quick call to her sister, confirming plans for the weekend. Her voice was calm, her words easy, her life seemingly untouched by chaos. But at 10:47 p.m., something changed. A neighbor on Pinewood Street, Mr. Lyle Patterson, reported hearing an unusual sound. He described it not as a scream, but a faint call, a sound almost lost in the rain. He glanced out his window but saw nothing unusual, just the familiar sight of empty sidewalks glistening under streetlights. Sarah's bungalow, sitting across the street from his, appeared silent, its porch light casting shadows on the steps. The next morning, Sarah didn't show up at work. Concerned, her colleague Margaret called Sarah's home, but there was no answer. By afternoon, worry turned into alarm. Margaret reached out to Sarah's sister, who decided to visit the house. What she found was chilling. Sarah's car parked in the driveway, groceries sitting untouched on the kitchen counter, and a faint hum of the TV still playing in the living room. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. The small town of Millhaven was shaken. Sarah's quiet life had taken a turn that no one could explain. Her doors were locked, her belongings undisturbed, yet she had vanished. The kind of disappearance that left no obvious trail, only questions that grew heavier with every passing day. Investigators pieced together her movements, tracking receipts, phone logs, and conversations. Witness reports were few and vague. No one had seen Sarah leave her house that night, no suspicious activity had been noted. It was as though she had been erased in an instant, leaving behind the faintest imprint of her existence. The days following Sarah's disappearance unraveled a peculiar sequence of events, each detail adding another layer to the mystery. Investigators combed through her quiet bungalow, searching for anything that might reveal where she had gone. The kitchen appeared untouched beyond the neatly placed grocery bags. The living room, too, was undisturbed, a blanket folded on the arm of the couch, the television remote resting precisely in its usual spot. But one detail stood out: her bedroom window was slightly ajar, rainwater pooling on the sill. Was this a sign of an intruder, or merely something Sarah herself had overlooked? Neighbors began to recount their own fragments of that night. Mr. Lyle Patterson, who had heard the faint call amidst the rain, recalled watching the street from his window for a moment longer than usual. It felt odd, he later stated, the kind of night where everything's quiet, but something just doesn't sit right. Could he have glimpsed something, someone, had he watched just a moment longer? Or was the rain too heavy, too obscuring for any shadow to betray its presence? Another neighbor, Mrs. Helen Adkins, reported hearing the faint crunch of gravel around the same time. Her house sat 2 doors down from Sarah's, her bedroom window facing the driveway. She thought it might have been someone walking by, but in hindsight, she couldn't be sure. You don't think much of it at the time, she admitted later. It's just the rain, or the wind, or maybe a stray cat. But now, it makes you wonder. As investigators pieced together these accounts, the timeline grew murky. Sarah's last known activity was a phone call to her sister at 9:15 p.m., a call described as ordinary, mundane, even cheerful. Less than 2 hours later, she had seemingly vanished into the storm. There was no sign of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle. Could she have left willingly? Was someone waiting for her in the shadows? And most hauntingly, did anyone hear her cries that night, or were they lost, smothered by the incessant rain? Theories began to circulate, each more unsettling than the last. Some speculated that Sarah had known her abductor, that she had opened her door willingly, trusting the person on the other side. Others pointed to the open window as a sign of something more sinister, an entry point, perhaps, for someone who had watched and waited for the right moment. But the lack of evidence was as perplexing as the event itself. There were no footprints in the muddy ground surrounding the house, no fingerprints left on the sill. It was as though the rain had washed away every trace, erasing the crime from existence. The police, struggling to make sense of the case, questioned anyone who might have crossed paths with Sarah that day. Her colleagues, her students' parents, even the cashier at the grocery store, all described her as the same person she had always been, calm, kind, and entirely unremarkable. There was no sign of distress, no indication that she had feared for her safety. But could anyone truly know what lay beneath the surface of someone else's life? Had Sarah kept secrets that no one could have imagined? Or was she simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time, on a night when the rain refused to stop? The investigation continued, but each clue seemed to lead nowhere. Surveillance footage from the grocery store showed Sarah leaving with her bags, walking calmly to her car. The street cameras on Pinewood Street revealed nothing out of the ordinary, no suspicious vehicles, no unfamiliar faces. It was as though the night had swallowed her whole, leaving only silence and rain in its wake. And so, the question lingers, what truly happened to Sarah Whitley on that stormy November night? Did someone come for her, under the guise of familiarity? Did she leave willingly, her steps guided by purpose we cannot know? Or does the answer lie in something we've yet to uncover, hidden away, waiting to resurface as the rain falls once again? As days turned into weeks, the investigation into Sarah Whitley's disappearance struggled to gain momentum. The case, at first treated as a routine missing persons report, soon drew the attention of state authorities when the lack of evidence painted a far graver picture. Millhaven, once a town known for its tranquility, became the backdrop for endless questions with too few answers. What we know is this: Sarah's last confirmed sighting was captured on the grainy security footage of the Pinewood grocery market. She appeared composed, exchanging pleasantries with the cashier, and left the store at precisely 7:46 p.m. Her drive home, based on the timestamp, would have placed her at her bungalow by 8 p.m. After that, the night grows inexplicably silent. The investigation turned up very little in terms of physical evidence. The unlocked back door was perplexing. Sarah rarely, if ever, used it. Yet it bore no signs of forced entry, leaving open the possibility that it had been left ajar by someone she knew. Her neighbors, despite being home during the critical hours of her disappearance, saw nothing beyond the faint shadows of the rain dancing on their windows. And the open bedroom window? It remained one of the more mysterious elements. Was it an entry point or a red herring? To this day, no one can say for sure. One of the more chilling elements of this case lies in Sarah's phone records. Investigators found that at 10:13 p.m., nearly an hour after her last known activity, there was an outgoing call placed from her landline. The call lasted only 8 seconds, and when traced, it led to a now disconnected number associated with a payphone located nearly 50 miles away. Who was on the other end of that brief connection? Could this call have been a cry for help? Or was it something far more cryptic? Despite these perplexing details, the case offered no clear suspects. Sarah's circle of friends and family were thoroughly vetted, each coming up empty. The residents of Millhaven were questioned repeatedly, but no one could recall seeing anything out of the ordinary that night. Even the nearby highways and rest stops yielded nothing substantial, no abandoned vehicles, no reported sightings. Over the years, theories surrounding Sarah's disappearance have multiplied, each as unsettling as the last. One of the prevailing ideas suggests that Sarah may have been targeted by someone who had been watching her for weeks, perhaps longer. Her predictable routine, home by 8 p.m., lights out by 10 p.m., could have made her an easy target for someone looking to commit the unthinkable. But if this is true, why leave so few traces? Why not take anything that might suggest a motive, valuables, belongings, anything? Another theory posits that Sarah knew her abductor. Perhaps it was a friend or acquaintance who convinced her to let them in, someone she trusted. The lack of any signs of struggle in the house supports this idea. But if this is the case, who could it have been? And what could have driven them to make her vanish so completely? Some take a more speculative approach, suggesting that Sarah's disappearance may have been part of a broader pattern. Over the decades, there have been sporadic reports of missing persons in the surrounding counties, all with eerily similar circumstances: quiet individuals, last seen in their homes on rainy nights, no obvious connections between them. Could there be an unseen thread tying these cases together? A shadow moving unnoticed through the lives of ordinary people? And then there's the grim possibility that Sarah's story may never be resolved. That her final hours, her final moments, exist only as fragments scattered across time, fragments that refuse to align, leaving us with nothing but rain-soaked questions and shadows cast by streetlights. Despite the efforts of investigators, and the curiosity of those who continue to analyze the case, Sarah Whitley remains missing. Her bungalow on Pinewood Street was eventually sold, the new occupants unaware of its history. Her family moved away, unable to bear the weight of her absence. And Millhaven, once consumed by the tragedy, has slowly returned to its quiet existence, though whispers of that night still surface with each passing storm. As the rain falls now, as you listen, perhaps you find yourself wondering, what truly happened to Sarah Whitley? Was she taken by someone she trusted, someone who knew her? Or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? These questions linger, unanswered, as the story of that rainy November night fades into history. And so, as the rain falls tonight, much like it did on that fateful November night, Sarah Whitley's story lingers, an unfinished chapter in the book of time. We've walked through her life, her final known moments, and the puzzling absence that followed. Yet, the truth remains elusive, like the faint whispers of wind weaving through the rain. It's in these quiet moments, as the world around us slows down, that we reflect not only on her story but on the fragility of certainty itself. Perhaps what makes Sarah's story resonate so deeply is the ordinariness of it all. She wasn't a celebrity or someone seeking the spotlight. She was one of us, living a quiet, familiar life. It's a reminder that mystery doesn't always wear the guise of the extraordinary. Sometimes, it resides in the simplest corners of our lives, waiting to emerge when least expected. Story 2. It was the year 1975. A simpler time, they called it, though the simplicity often hid the secrets that lingered beneath the surface of ordinary lives. The town of Clearwater was one of those places, a small, tightly knit community surrounded by dense, towering forests. It was the sort of town where life moved quietly, like the raindrops rolling down the leaves. The kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, where greetings were exchanged at the local grocery store, and stories were shared during Sunday picnics by the lake. Clearwater rested on the edge of an old railway line, a relic from an era long past. The tracks, partially hidden by overgrown weeds, stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The people of Clearwater were used to the rhythm of life, the distant hum of trains that no longer came, the familiar sight of Mr. Ferguson closing his hardware shop at precisely 6 p.m., and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread wafting from Mrs. Temple's bakery every morning. The town had an unspoken charm, embraced by its residents, who had little reason to suspect that anything unusual could ever disrupt their lives. But one rainy night in June, things would change. The rain, much like the one you hear now, had been falling steadily all day, softening the soil and filling the air with the earthy scent of the woods. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, as if a reminder of something just out of reach, a reminder that, even in the calmest of places, storms have a way of leaving their mark. In a modest house near the edge of the woods lived the Carter family, James and Catherine, a couple who had moved to Clearwater 10 years prior, and their 2 children, Abigail and Thomas. The Carter home was unassuming, with its faded blue shutters and flower beds that Catherine tended to lovingly every spring. James worked as a foreman at the local lumber mill, while Catherine taught art classes at the community center. Abigail, the older of the 2 children, was a curious 12-year-old with a penchant for drawing animals she had seen in the woods. Thomas, age 9, was quieter, spending hours with his favorite book about trains, dreaming about distant adventures. To anyone passing by, the Carters seemed like the perfect family, a picture of harmony, kindness, and humility. They were well liked in the community, often seen participating in town events or offering help to neighbors in need. And yet, on that particular evening, as the rain continued its steady rhythm, something happened that would leave Clearwater questioning everything it thought it knew. At precisely 8:15 p.m., Catherine closed the curtains to the living room window, as she always did before sitting down to read her favorite novel by the fireplace. Abigail was upstairs sketching horses in her notebook, and Thomas had fallen asleep, his book still open beside him. James was expected home soon. He had stayed late at the mill to finish an urgent project. The scene was peaceful, mundane, and predictable. But there are moments in life when quiet routines conceal unexpected disruptions. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived alone, noticed something peculiar. She wasn't the type to meddle, but from her window, she thought she saw a shadow pass near the Carter home. She dismissed it at first, a trick of the light, perhaps, but the image stuck with her. Moments later, she heard what sounded like muffled voices, though the rain made it difficult to discern what was being said. By morning, Clearwater awoke to a startling revelation. The Carter family, in their ordinary and familiar way, seemed to have vanished. Their home stood eerily silent, no sign of James returning home from the mill, no laughter from the children, no movement at all. The flower beds remained undisturbed, the curtains drawn just as Catherine had closed them, and the rainwater pooled gently in the driveway. Mrs. Henderson, troubled by what she had seen and heard, tried to explain to the neighbors, but her account offered little clarity. She couldn't describe the shadow in detail, nor could she pinpoint the source of the voices. The police arrived soon after, trying to piece together the events of the night. Clearwater, a town so familiar with routine, found itself grappling with something entirely unknown, a mystery that didn't align with the comforting predictability of their lives. As we step deeper into this story, the rain continues to guide us. It falls steadily, as it has since that night, as if whispering secrets only it knows. What could have led to the Carters' disappearance? Were there signs that the town missed, or was it truly an event no one could have foreseen? These are the questions we will explore, one step at a time, as the rhythm of the rain accompanies us. At 6:45 p.m., James Carter was finishing up his shift at the lumber mill. His co-workers recall him leaving in his usual cheerful manner, calling out goodbyes as he stepped out into the light drizzle. James had planned to stop by the corner store to pick up milk before heading home, something Catherine had reminded him of earlier that day. Witnesses at the store confirmed seeing him briefly. He exchanged polite greetings, paid for the milk, and left within minutes. As he stepped out, the drizzle began to intensify, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the growing rhythm of raindrops on the pavement. Back at the Carter house, the evening carried on as expected. Catherine had prepared a simple dinner and was tidying up in the kitchen. Abigail, ever immersed in her drawings, had found inspiration in the sound of the rain and was sketching a scene of horses galloping through a storm. Thomas, sleepy from the excitement of the day, had already retreated to his room, his train book still open beside him. The atmosphere was calm, undisturbed by anything unusual. By 8 p.m., the rain had picked up. Catherine, true to her habit, closed the living room curtains and lit the small lamp by the armchair where she usually sat to read. She glanced at the clock, noting that James would be home soon. She wasn't worried, James was always punctual, but a brief delay wasn't out of the ordinary, especially on a rainy night. The first subtle sign of unease came at 8:10 p.m. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, still sitting by her window, noticed a figure moving near the edge of the woods. It wasn't unusual for the local kids to play there, even in the rain, but something about the figure caught her attention. It seemed too large, too deliberate in its movements. She leaned closer to the window, her curiosity piqued, but the figure disappeared behind the trees before she could get a clear look. At 8:15 p.m., as Catherine settled into her chair with a book, a faint noise came from outside, a sound that seemed out of place amidst the rain. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to momentarily draw her attention. She paused, listening carefully. Was it the creak of the garden gate? The sound was so subtle, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Dismissing the thought, she returned to her book, though a slight feeling of unease lingered. Meanwhile, Abigail, still in her room, heard what she thought was a soft knock at the front door. Curious, she set down her sketchpad and called out to her mother, but Catherine didn't seem to hear. Abigail decided not to investigate further, assuming it was just her father returning home. The rain often played tricks with sounds, making it hard to tell where they came from. And then, at 8:30 p.m., the lights in the Carter house flickered briefly, a common occurrence during storms in Clearwater. The flicker lasted only a second, and everything returned to normal. Or so it seemed. The timeline from this point grows hazy. Neighbors recall hearing nothing unusual, apart from the rain. The Carter house remained quiet, with no outward signs of disturbance. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had been keeping a watchful eye, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't until the next morning that the full weight of the situation became clear. James's car was found parked neatly in the driveway, yet there was no sign of him or his family inside the house. The front door was locked, the windows closed, and nothing appeared to be out of place. Breakfast plates were still on the kitchen counter, untouched, and Abigail's sketchbook lay open on her desk, her drawing unfinished. It was as if time had simply stopped within those walls. The rain, ever steady, had washed away any trace of what might have happened that night. Footprints, if there had been any, were long gone. The only clue, if it could even be called that, was the faint scent of damp earth and rain-soaked leaves that lingered near the garden gate. As investigators began to piece together the events of that night, questions arose that seemed to have no answers. Why would an entire family vanish without a trace? Were there any signs of struggle, any reason to suspect foul play? And what of the shadow Mrs. Henderson had seen near the woods? Was it connected, or merely a coincidence? These are the questions that still echo in the minds of those who knew the Carters. Questions that remind us of the fragile boundary between the familiar and the unknown. As the rain continues to fall, let us walk step by step through the layers of this mystery, uncovering what little we can and pondering what remains hidden. As the sun rose over Clearwater the morning after the Carters' disappearance, the rain persisted, soft and steady, like the town's silent mourning. News spread quickly in such a small community. By mid-morning, neighbors had gathered near the Carter home, their murmured conversations punctuated by the patter of rain against umbrellas. People spoke in hushed tones, their words heavy with concern and confusion. It wasn't every day that an entire family simply vanished without explanation. The police arrived promptly, their cars parked on the wet gravel driveway. Clearwater's sheriff, Harold Thompson, had served the town for over 2 decades and was known for his meticulous nature. But even he seemed unsettled as he stepped into the house for the first time that morning, his boots leaving faint imprints on the rain-dampened ground. Inside the home, nothing appeared outwardly disturbed. The breakfast plates on the kitchen counter were undisturbed, as though the family had left mid-meal. The living room, where Catherine had been reading the night before, was untouched, her book still resting on the armrest of the chair, its pages slightly warped from the dampness in the air. Abigail's sketchbook lay open upstairs, her drawing of horses halted mid-stroke. Everything pointed to a family who had been carrying out their usual routines, completely unaware of the storm, not just outside but within. The sheriff started by interviewing Mrs. Henderson, the Carters' neighbor, who had last seen them, or rather, the shadows that might have been them, on the night in question. Her account was vague, at best. She mentioned seeing a figure moving near the woods and hearing muffled voices, but the pouring rain had obscured much of what she could have heard or seen. It was dark, and the rain made everything uncertain, she admitted, her voice faltering. The first twist came when a pair of officers discovered James Carter's car parked neatly in the driveway. The keys were still in the ignition, but the doors were locked. This small detail puzzled investigators. Why would James, known for his reliability, lock his car and enter his house, only for the entire family to disappear within the span of a few hours? And if something had happened outside, why was the car untouched? Sheriff Thompson ordered a more thorough search of the property, starting with the backyard and the area near the woods where Mrs. Henderson had noticed the shadowy figure. The rain had erased most of the physical evidence, but near the garden gate, an officer found something unusual, a single footprint, barely visible in the soft earth. It wasn't large enough to belong to James, nor small enough to belong to Abigail or Thomas. Its edges were blurred by the rain, but it raised an important question: was someone else present that night? As the hours stretched into the day, the investigation widened. Officers spoke with James's co-workers, the clerk at the corner store, and neighbors up and down the street. Everyone described the Carters as kind, unassuming people who had no known enemies. There were no reports of arguments or disturbances. No one in Clearwater could imagine why anyone would want to harm them. And yet, the question lingered: if not harm, then what? By evening, theories began to emerge. Some believed the Carters had chosen to leave voluntarily, perhaps to start anew somewhere far away. But why would they leave without packing, without saying goodbye to anyone they knew? Others speculated about the involvement of an outsider, someone who had come to town unnoticed, with intentions only they understood. And then there were those who whispered about the woods themselves, a place steeped in local folklore. Could the woods have held answers, or even more questions? Sheriff Thompson dismissed the more outlandish theories, focusing instead on tangible leads. He combed through every piece of evidence, no matter how small, hoping to piece together the story of that night. But as the investigation deepened, more questions arose than answers. For instance, why had the lights in the house flickered briefly, as some neighbors reported, just before the family vanished? Was it merely a storm-related outage, or could it have been something else entirely? Another twist emerged when the sheriff examined Catherine's diary, found neatly tucked away in her bedside table. Most of its pages were filled with her thoughts on daily life, her love for her family, and her plans for the future. But one entry, written just 2 nights before the family vanished, stood out. It read, simply, "I've noticed something unusual near the woods. I don't want to worry James, but I'll keep an eye out." The ambiguity of the entry raised even more questions. What had Catherine seen? Had she mentioned it to anyone else? And could it have been related to what happened that night? As the investigation entered its second day, the rain began to ease, leaving behind a mist that clung to the ground like a ghostly presence. The Carter home remained sealed off, a place of unanswered questions and silent echoes. The townspeople speculated endlessly, their theories fueled by the scant clues and the gaps between them. Was it a crime of opportunity? A moment of chance that spiraled into something far more tragic? Or had the Carters been deliberately targeted, chosen for reasons no one could comprehend? Even now, as we explore the threads of this story, these questions remain. The rain has long since washed away the evidence, but it cannot erase the mystery that lingers. What truly happened to the Carter family on that rainy night in Clearwater? And will the truth ever come to light? The investigation into the disappearance of the Carter family would eventually come to a halt. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet the questions that haunted the town of Clearwater remained unanswered. The sheriff, having exhausted every lead, was forced to declare the case cold, a term that carried with it an unspoken resignation. For the people of Clearwater, the realization that closure might never come was unsettling. How could such an ordinary family simply cease to exist, leaving behind no trace except the echoes of their lives? Some speculated that the footprint near the garden gate, blurred by the rain, could have belonged to someone who had come from out of town, a stranger with motives only they understood. Others insisted that the diary entry mentioning the woods held the key, though no one could decipher its meaning. Catherine's words, so simple and cryptic, "I've noticed something unusual near the woods. I don't want to worry James, but I'll keep an eye out," were read and reread by investigators, each interpretation leading to more dead ends. The Carter home, once the heart of their family, became an eerie monument to their absence. It stood quietly at the edge of the woods, its blue shutters faded and its flower beds overtaken by weeds. Occasionally, curious passers-by would pause to look at the house, perhaps hoping to glimpse a clue that others had missed, but the house gave no answers. It had become a shell, its warmth and life gone, replaced by silence. Over time, Clearwater's residents learned to live with the unanswered questions. Stories of the Carters' disappearance became part of the town's folklore, retold at gatherings, often embellished with imagined details that filled the gaps left by reality. For some, the stories were a way of coping with the unexplainable, a way to preserve the memory of the family that had once been part of their lives. For others, the stories were simply an unsettling reminder of how fragile the boundary between the known and unknown could be. Despite the uncertainty, one thing became clear: the rain, which had played such a central role in the events of that night, seemed to linger in the minds of those who remembered. It wasn't just the rain that had obscured sounds and footprints, it was the rain that seemed to whisper secrets, as though it held answers that no human could decipher. On stormy nights, when the rhythm of raindrops filled the air, some residents claimed they could feel the presence of the Carters, watching, waiting, still part of the town in some inexplicable way. Was it truly a crime of opportunity, a chance encounter that spiraled beyond comprehension? Or was it something else? A series of events so carefully orchestrated that only silence remained? Was the shadow near the woods the key to unraveling the mystery, or was it merely an illusion, a trick of the light and rain? These questions would continue to haunt Clearwater for generations. As we reach the end of this story too, the rain continues to fall softly, as it did on that night, carrying with it the weight of mysteries that remain unsolved. Perhaps the answers were washed away, carried by the storm into the depths of the woods, where no one would ever find them. Or perhaps the answers never truly existed, leaving us to wonder about the limits of our understanding and the secrets that life can hold. Let this tale remind us that not all stories end with clarity. Some linger like the rain itself, present, yet intangible, weaving through the fabric of our thoughts and dreams. And as the night stretches on, and the rain continues its steady rhythm, let us reflect on the mysteries that surround us. The stories will never fully unravel, and the beauty in simply letting them be. Story 3. Imagine a place, a town, small and unassuming. It could be any town, couldn't it? It's a place where people greet each other by name, where streets remain unchanged for decades, and where the rhythm of life feels predictable. The rain falls here too, its whispers blending into the hum of daily existence. But for those who called it home, this town became the setting of an enigma so profound that its echoes never truly left. Nestled in the embrace of a quiet valley, beneath the watchful shadows of towering pines, lies the town of Eldermore. Eldermore isn't a place you'd find marked on most maps. It's small, understated, a town where life follows a slow and steady rhythm, untouched by the frenzy of the outside world. Narrow streets wind their way through rows of homes, some new and others worn with age. Each house tells a story. From the creaky porches where families have gathered for decades to the freshly painted shutters of newcomers seeking peace, Eldermore has always been a place for those searching for simplicity. In this community, days are measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the changing seasons that seem to wrap the valley in a blanket of calm. Eldermore's charm lies in its quiet certainty, the shared understanding among its residents that life here is predictable, dependable. People greet each other by name, trading smiles and a few words as they pass by the only grocery store, the post office, or the diner where the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifts out to meet the morning air. It's a town where everyone knows everyone, or so they believe. The mayor, Mr. Emerson, a figure of unwavering reliability, has held office for over 2 decades. There's Mrs. Calloway, who runs the little bookstore near the edge of Main Street, a haven for curious readers and dreamers. And then there's young Emily Rivers, whose laughter echoes along the paths of the park as she chases her golden retriever, Max. These are just a few of Eldermore's many faces, each with their routines, their lives intertwined in the tapestry of this valley. On the surface, the people of Eldermore appear unremarkable, ordinary. But that is where the story begins to shift. Although life seemed calm in Eldermore, there were whispers, quiet enough to dismiss, yet persistent enough to linger in the mind. Strange happenings began to pepper the town's otherwise uneventful days. A stranger passing through, asking peculiar questions. The sound of footsteps in the night, carried faintly by the valley's still air. And the odd sensation, shared by more than a few, that someone, or something, was watching. These moments were fleeting, easy to ignore. But for some, they raised questions, subtle and unsettling, as though the town itself were trying to speak. Take, for example, the story of Clara Monroe. Clara, a retired schoolteacher known for her meticulous nature, had lived in Eldermore longer than most. Her days were spent tending to her garden or arranging books by height and color on the shelves of her small living room. One day, as she returned home from her weekly trip to the market, she noticed something peculiar, a crack on the frame of her kitchen window, no larger than the width of a fingernail. It seemed insignificant at first, but when she began to notice other oddities, like the faint scent of tobacco smoke lingering in her hallway despite never smoking a day in her life, Clara started to feel uneasy. She never spoke of it to anyone, not even to her neighbor Henry, who often helped her with odd jobs around the house. Perhaps she thought it was nothing, a trick of her mind, the product of spending too much time alone. But whatever the reason, Clara wasn't the only one experiencing these quiet disturbances. Then there was Samuel Hart, a young man who worked at the gas station near the valley's edge. Samuel was practical, grounded, someone who preferred logic and reason over flights of fancy. But even Samuel couldn't explain what happened one evening as he closed up the station. It was past midnight, the rain falling steadily just like tonight, and Samuel was wiping down the counter when he heard it, the faint sound of a woman humming, coming from the empty lot next door. He stepped outside, looked around, but there was no one. Just the rain and the soft hum of the streetlights. Samuel dismissed it as his imagination, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching him from the shadows. These small occurrences, while easy to brush aside, began weaving themselves into the fabric of Eldermore's daily life, unnoticed by many but impossible to ignore for a few. And so, the town continued to drift through its quiet days, carrying the secrets it refused to share. What happened in Eldermore didn't come as a sudden storm, it arrived quietly, like the rain tonight, threading itself into the lives of those who called this valley home. It was only later, when the pieces began to fall into place, that they realized how deeply the mystery had already taken root. It was a crisp autumn evening in Eldermore, the kind where the air feels charged with the promise of change yet still gentle enough to lull one into a sense of tranquility. The streets were quiet, lined with parked cars that seemed to glow faintly under the amber streetlights. Leaves, painted in hues of orange and gold, fluttered from the trees above and gathered in heaps along the sidewalks, the rain softening their descent like whispers in the dark. Among these still streets was Acorn Lane, a path many of the townsfolk knew well. It cut a narrow line between rows of neat, modest houses, leading eventually to the old bridge that crossed over Mill Creek, a favorite spot for children during warmer months, though rarely visited once autumn settled in. That night, Acorn Lane was as unremarkable as ever. But as the clock struck 9 and the rain began to fall more steadily, the silence of this peaceful neighborhood was suddenly interrupted by a sound unlike any heard before. A single scream, a cry sharp enough to momentarily pierce the rhythmic patter of the rain, echoed through the air. It was quick, fleeting, like the rustle of wind breaking through leaves. For those nearby, it was barely noticeable, a sound that could have been dismissed as nothing more than the hum of a distant train or the bark of a restless dog. But for others, closer to its source, that scream lingered, hanging in the air like an unanswered question. Then silence returned, and the rain continued its song. On the following morning, Eldermore woke to a peculiar sight. Near the bridge at Mill Creek, a small gathering of townsfolk had formed, drawn by a discovery that none could fully explain. There, nestled among the fallen leaves, lay a single black umbrella, its handle splintered, its fabric torn as though it had weathered a storm far more violent than the gentle rain that had passed the night before. It was an ordinary object, one that could easily belong to any of them, yet its presence felt strange, out of place. Who had left it there, and why? And perhaps more unsettling, where was its owner? Among those gathered was Clara Monroe, her keen eye catching details others overlooked. She noticed faint smudges along the wooden beams of the bridge, marks too deliberate to be random. "Looks like someone leaned here," she murmured, though her voice barely carried over the murmur of the crowd. Henry, her neighbor, nodded in agreement but offered no further remark. The scene at the bridge grew colder, not from the autumn chill but from the weight of questions no one dared to ask aloud. At the same time, across town, Samuel Hart stood behind the counter of the gas station, his thoughts preoccupied. He couldn't forget the strange hum he'd heard on the night of the rain, nor could he dismiss the uneasy feeling it had left him with. Though he hadn't told anyone, Samuel had noticed something peculiar about the lot where the sound had seemed to originate. Amid the overgrown grass, there were faint impressions in the soil, footprints, barely distinguishable beneath the layers of water and earth left by the storm. He chose not to investigate further, telling himself it was nothing of consequence. Yet as the news of the umbrella at Mill Creek began to circulate, Samuel couldn't help but wonder if the two were connected. The days that followed brought no answers to the mystery. Eldermore seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, though the quiet unease lingered like a faint shadow behind closed doors. The black umbrella remained where it had been found, untouched and unmoved, as though waiting for someone to claim it. For some, it became little more than a passing curiosity, a detail they would soon forget. But for others, particularly Clara and Samuel, it was a thread that begged to be unraveled. And as the rain returned to Eldermore, washing over its streets and rooftops, the town's unspoken questions grew louder, their whispers blending with the rhythm of the falling drops. Eldermore was no stranger to whispers of peculiarities, but what had begun as a quiet curiosity was now something far more unsettling. It wasn't long before the town's small police department was brought into the fold. The investigation began simply, almost cautiously, as though even the detectives themselves were hesitant to disturb whatever was lingering beneath the surface. Detective Arthur Greaves, a man of few words but keen observations, was tasked with leading the inquiry. Known for his steady demeanor, Arthur was someone who could find the threads others overlooked. And in a place like Eldermore, where secrets often hid in plain sight, that skill would prove invaluable. Arthur's first stop was Mill Creek, where the black umbrella remained untouched since its discovery. He approached the scene slowly, taking in the details as the soft rain dampened the earth beneath his boots. The torn fabric of the umbrella caught his eye, not for what it was, but for what it might signify. He bent down, tracing a finger along the splintered handle, his mind turning over possibilities. Nearby, he noticed the faint smudges along the bridge's wooden beams that Clara Monroe had remarked upon. Arthur took note of their placement, considering whether they might point to someone leaning there, watching the water below, or perhaps watching something else entirely. From the bridge, Arthur's investigation expanded outward, his focus shifting to those who had passed through Acorn Lane on the night of the scream. He spoke with residents, his questions calm and deliberate. Most had heard nothing unusual, their lives unaffected by the rain or the events that followed. But then came Samuel Hart, the young gas station attendant, whose account of the faint humming sound caught Arthur's attention. Samuel hesitated as he shared his experience, uncertain whether it held any real significance, but Arthur listened carefully. It wasn't the sound itself, Samuel explained, his voice steady but reflective, it was the feeling, the sense that someone was there, just out of sight. Arthur nodded, filing the detail away in his mind alongside the footprints Samuel had described, now softened by the rain and time. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation continued quietly, its progress marked by small discoveries rather than grand revelations. Arthur began piecing together a timeline, subtle connections forming like strands of a web. In the corner of the diner, he overheard two patrons discussing a figure they'd noticed near Mill Creek on the night in question, someone standing still beneath the streetlight, umbrella in hand, their face obscured by shadows. The description matched nothing Arthur had heard before, but it added another layer to the mystery, another thread waiting to be pulled. Meanwhile, Clara Monroe's keen observations proved equally valuable. She approached Arthur one afternoon with a detail she had only just noticed, the faint outline of initials etched into the bridge's wooden planks. Though weathered and nearly invisible, the marking suggested someone had left their mark there years ago, perhaps inadvertently. Arthur took note, wondering if the initials might connect to the footprints Samuel had mentioned or the figure described by the diner patrons. It was a small clue, but in a case like this, even the smallest details had the potential to shift the narrative. Throughout the investigation, Arthur maintained a careful balance between logic and intuition, navigating the puzzle piece by piece without rushing toward conclusions. His steady pace mirrored the rain that fell over Eldermore each night, persistent but patient, revealing the town's hidden secrets one drop at a time. Yet, despite his progress, the answers remained elusive, a quiet reminder that some mysteries resist resolution, lingering just beyond reach. By the end of the third week, Arthur stood at the edge of Mill Creek once more, his gaze fixed on the dark water below. The bridge had become both a focal point and a symbol of the investigation's twists and turns, its wooden beams carrying the weight of unanswered questions. As he traced his fingers along the railing, the initials Clara had discovered seemed to stare back at him, almost daring him to uncover their meaning. Arthur inhaled deeply, the scent of rain and earth filling his senses, and turned to leave. There was still much to be done, but as the rain continued to fall over Eldermore, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer to the truth than he realized. By the fourth week of the investigation, Detective Arthur Greaves found himself standing once again by the old bridge at Mill Creek, a place that had become both familiar and enigmatic. The black umbrella, now slightly worn by the elements, remained as it had been on the day it was discovered, a silent witness to events that had yet to fully reveal themselves. Arthur's mind wandered through the clues he'd gathered, each one a thread that had led him closer to the truth. The smudges on the bridge's beams, the faint footprints in the soil, the initials etched into the wood, each piece was small on its own, but together, they formed a picture that was finally beginning to come into focus. The turning point came on a rain-soaked afternoon when Clara Monroe approached Arthur with a new observation. She'd noticed that the initials on the bridge, though weathered, seemed to match those carved into an old, abandoned bench near the diner, a bench where many believed the figure described by the patrons had been seen standing beneath the streetlight on the night of the scream. Clara's attention to detail had once again proven invaluable, and Arthur quickly set to work connecting the dots. His inquiry led him to the local archives, where he uncovered a record of the bench's installation nearly 2 decades prior. It had been donated anonymously, but the initials carved into its surface matched those on the bridge. This connection, seemingly insignificant to some, became the missing link that tied the investigation together. Arthur's next step was to revisit Samuel Hart, whose account of the humming sound now seemed more relevant than ever. Samuel had mentioned faint footprints near the lot by the gas station, a detail Arthur had initially filed away as circumstantial. But with Clara's discovery of the initials, Arthur realized there might be a connection between the figure described by the diner patrons and the sound Samuel had heard. He returned to the lot, this time examining the soil with greater care. Beneath the layers of rain-soaked earth, he found a single object, a small, rusted key, seemingly forgotten by time. It bore the same initials as the bridge and bench, a detail that confirmed Arthur's growing suspicion that the figure had been tied to these places in ways yet to be understood. As the puzzle began to come together, Arthur revisited the timeline of events, piecing together the movements of the figure described near Mill Creek. The scream, the abandoned umbrella, the humming sound, all were connected, not by chance but by deliberate intention. What had initially appeared as random occurrences were now part of a larger story, one that pointed to an individual who had long operated quietly within Eldermore's shadows. Though their motives remained unclear, Arthur uncovered enough evidence to identify them, a name that had once been familiar to the town but had faded from memory over the years. It was someone who had sought solitude within the valley, someone whose presence had been marked by their connection to the places that now carried their initials. The resolution of the case was quiet, understated, much like the town itself. Eldermore found solace not in dramatic revelations but in the steady uncovering of truths that had lingered for too long. For Clara Monroe, it was a reminder that even the smallest details could hold profound meaning. For Samuel Hart, it was an affirmation of the importance of intuition, of listening not just to the sounds around him but to the feelings they evoked. And for Arthur Greaves, it was a testament to patience, to the idea that answers often emerge not in haste but in the quiet persistence of those willing to seek them. As Eldermore returned to its usual rhythm, the bridge at Mill Creek remained a place of reflection, a symbol of the town's ability to endure and grow through its mysteries. The black umbrella was eventually removed, but its memory lingered, woven into the fabric of the town's stories. The rain continued to fall each night, its rhythm unchanged, as though carrying the weight of the town's secrets and lessons learned. And while the case had been solved, its impact remained, shaping the lives of those who had been touched by its quiet call to introspection. Eldermore is, and always will be, a place of quiet beauty, a valley where the mundane and the extraordinary intertwine, and where even the rain seems to carry whispers of stories yet to be told. Tonight, as you listen, perhaps you'll find a piece of Eldermore in your own life, a reminder to look closely, to listen deeply, and to let the quiet moments guide you toward understanding. Sleep well under the gentle rain, and may tomorrow bring its own quiet revelations. Story 4. This story takes place in a town that might remind you of somewhere you've been or somewhere you've imagined. Tucked away from the chaos of the world, it was a place of simple routines and familiar faces, a small, unassuming community surrounded by rolling hills that seemed to embrace it like a protective cocoon. The kind of place where neighbors exchanged smiles at the market, children played freely in the streets, and the world felt safe. The town of Meadowbrook was known for its quiet charm. Its cobbled streets glistened under the rain, and the air often carried the faint, earthy scent of the nearby forest. A single main road ran through the heart of the town, lined with modest shops, a diner that served the best coffee for miles, and a quaint library that seemed to hold more stories than the town had people. It was the sort of place where time moved a little slower, and life felt, for the most part, predictable. But on the outskirts of Meadowbrook, just beyond where the streetlights ended and the shadows of the trees grew denser, there stood an old farmhouse. Weathered by years of wind and rain, it had a character all its own. Its peeling paint and creaking floorboards seemed to whisper secrets from the past. To those who passed by, it was just another relic of a bygone era. Yet for one family, it was home. The Hartley family had lived in the farmhouse for generations. They were a modest, hard-working family, respected and well-liked by the townsfolk. There was Evelyn Hartley, a woman in her late 40s with a warmth that made her instantly approachable. She ran the small floral shop on the main street and was known for her eye for beauty and her uncanny ability to grow flowers even in the harshest weather. Her husband, Samuel, was a carpenter, quiet, dependable, and the kind of man who could fix just about anything. Then there was their daughter, Clara. At just 16, Clara was the light of their lives. She was bright, curious, and full of dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Meadowbrook. She had a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that was as infectious as it was genuine. Clara was the kind of person who saw the good in everyone and everything, even when it wasn't immediately obvious. It was a life of quiet contentment for the Hartleys, a life rooted in love and routine. But as the rain fell on Meadowbrook one fateful evening, the town's serenity would be shaken in ways no one could have foreseen. It began as any other evening in the Hartley household. The sound of rain tapping gently against the windows, the soft hum of the radio playing in the background, and the warmth of the fireplace casting a golden glow across the living room. Clara was at the kitchen table, her textbook spread out before her as she prepared for an upcoming exam. Evelyn was in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough for the next morning's bread, and Samuel was in his workshop, as he so often was, working on a new project. But amidst the ordinary, there were small details, things that, in hindsight, seemed to take on a significance that no one could have understood at the time. A phone call that rang once and then stopped before anyone could answer. The distant sound of a car engine that seemed to linger a little too long before fading into the night. And an unease that settled over the farmhouse, so subtle that it was easy to dismiss as nothing more than the imagination playing tricks in the dim light. The rain continued to fall, and the night stretched on, wrapping the town of Meadowbrook in its quiet embrace. But for the Hartleys, this night would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the community for years to come, a mystery that began in the warmth of their home but would soon spill out into the rainy streets and beyond. As the evening wore on in Meadowbrook, the rain began to intensify, wrapping the town in an almost tangible stillness. The Hartleys' farmhouse, a warm beacon amidst the darkened countryside, stood quietly at the edge of the town, its windows glowing softly against the backdrop of the storm. Inside, life carried on as usual. Evelyn had set the dough to rise and was now tidying up the kitchen. Samuel's hammer could be faintly heard from the workshop, and Clara, absorbed in her studies, scribbled notes with the determined focus of someone eager to chase their dreams. But beyond the comfort of their home, Meadowbrook had taken on a different, almost surreal quality. Streetlights cast dim halos onto the slick cobblestone streets. The shadows of the trees danced in the rhythm of the wind, creating fleeting shapes that seemed alive. And the silence, broken only by the rain, carried with it an unusual weight, one that left some townsfolk uneasy. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Evelyn glanced out of the window as she placed the last dish onto the drying rack. The rain streaked the glass, distorting the view of the road outside, but something caught her eye. A figure, perhaps just a shadow, moved near the edge of the forest. It was fleeting, almost too brief to be certain, and Evelyn dismissed it as her imagination. After all, the rain and dim light often played tricks on the mind. Around the same time, Clara, feeling restless, decided to step onto the porch for a breath of fresh air. The cool rain-scented breeze greeted her, carrying with it an unexpected sound, a faint rustle from the direction of the barn, too quiet to pinpoint. Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the porch steps, but eventually shrugged it off and returned inside, unaware of how that moment would replay in her memory days later. At 8:45 p.m., the Hartleys gathered in the living room as they often did in the evenings. Evelyn brought out her latest embroidery project. Samuel set down his tools and joined them with a book in hand. Clara, having finished her studies for the day, curled up in the armchair, phone in hand, scrolling through social media. It was the picture of a peaceful family night, untouched by the creeping unease that had begun to settle outside. Then, at precisely 9:02 p.m., the sound of footsteps reached the edge of their awareness, soft at first, almost blending with the rain, but undeniably present. Samuel, ever pragmatic, attributed the sound to the wind or an animal, while Evelyn suggested it could be a neighbor seeking shelter from the storm. Clara, however, felt an unshakable sense of curiosity. "Should we check?" she asked. Samuel hesitated, but ultimately dismissed the idea, reasoning that whoever it was would knock if they needed something. The rain grew heavier, masking the sound of the footsteps entirely. By 9:15 p.m., the family had returned to their calm routine, the momentary disturbance forgotten. But not far from the farmhouse, something, or someone, lingered, hidden within the shadows of the trees. Later that evening, Evelyn stepped outside to retrieve a basket of laundry she had left on the porch. As she reached for the basket, her gaze was drawn to the barn once again. This time, a faint light flickered inside, a soft, wavering glow that shouldn't have been there. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and quickly retreated inside. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think someone's in the barn." Samuel, trying to reassure her, grabbed a flashlight and headed out. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding despite the calm reassurance of her father's words. He returned moments later, his expression neutral. "Nothing there," he said simply, though his tone carried a hint of doubt. The night continued, the rain drowning out any further sounds, and the Hartleys eventually went to bed, each carrying their own quiet thoughts about the evening's peculiarities. But as the town slept, Meadowbrook seemed to hold its breath. What had begun as an ordinary night was slowly unraveling into something far more unsettling. Who, or what, was moving through the rain-soaked shadows of the town? Was it merely coincidence, or could there be a connection to the Hartleys that remained unseen? And, most hauntingly of all, were the details of this night destined to remain unexplained, much like the rain that washes over the earth without revealing its secrets? When dawn broke over Meadowbrook, the rain persisted, casting a dreary haze over the town. The first rays of light revealed the farmhouse in a state of unassuming quiet, its occupants still unaware of the gravity of what had transpired the night before. But as the hours unfolded, a series of unsettling discoveries began to ripple through the community. By mid-morning, Sheriff Tom Bennett, a man known for his calm demeanor and meticulous attention to detail, arrived at the Hartley farmhouse following a call from Evelyn. She had noticed something unusual. The barn door, which Samuel had locked the previous evening, was ajar, and scattered near its entrance were faint impressions in the muddy ground. Footprints. The kind that appeared human, though slightly distorted by the rain. The sheriff examined the scene closely, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The footprints led only a short distance before fading into the wet earth, as if the rain had claimed them for itself. Nearby, he found another peculiar detail, a single button from a coat, weathered and worn, lying half-buried in the mud. Evelyn confirmed it did not belong to anyone in her family. At first, these clues seemed minor, disconnected. But Sheriff Bennett, who had seen his fair share of odd cases, knew better than to dismiss them. He sent the button to the state crime lab for analysis and began piecing together what little information he had. His first step was speaking with the Hartleys, who recounted the events of the previous evening, the flickering light in the barn, the faint footsteps, the eerie sense that something was amiss. Meanwhile, in town, whispers of the incident began to circulate. Meadowbrook was a place where news traveled fast, and it wasn't long before other residents came forward with stories of their own. Mr. Peterson, who lived a mile down the road from the Hartleys, mentioned hearing what sounded like muffled voices near his property around 9:30 p.m. Another neighbor, Mrs. Collins, claimed to have seen a figure moving along the edge of the woods near her home shortly after sunset, a figure she described as not quite right, though she couldn't articulate why. Sheriff Bennett documented each account carefully, but patterns were difficult to discern. The clues were sparse, the witnesses uncertain, and the rain seemed to wash away more than just footprints. it erased the threads that tied the mystery together. As the investigation progressed, a series of missteps and dead ends began to frustrate efforts to uncover the truth. The crime lab reported that the button yielded no useful information. It was generic, mass-produced, with no distinctive markings to trace its origin. Attempts to match the footprints with known suspects proved equally fruitless, as the rain had distorted their shape beyond recognition. Days turned into weeks, and while the initial buzz of the investigation kept the town on edge, the lack of progress brought an uneasy calm. People began to resume their routines, though the Hartleys struggled to find peace. Clara, once the lively heart of the family, grew quieter, her thoughts often drifting to that night. Evelyn took solace in her flowers, pouring her energy into her shop, while Samuel busied himself in his workshop, trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy. Sheriff Bennett, however, refused to give up. Late one evening, he revisited the barn, hoping to find something he had missed. With his flashlight illuminating the worn floorboards, he noticed faint scratches near the doorway, marks that suggested something had been dragged. Though it was impossible to determine what, the discovery reignited his determination. But as he reflected on the evidence, or lack thereof, Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was overlooking. It's curious how some leads vanish into thin air, much like the rain that washes away footprints. Was there a connection between the witnesses' accounts and the clues found at the Hartley farmhouse? Or was the investigation destined to remain a puzzle, its pieces scattered by the storm? The rain continued to fall, as if nature itself conspired to shroud Meadowbrook in mystery. And as Bennett gazed into the shadows of the barn, he realized the answers might lie not in what was found, but in what had yet to be uncovered. The investigation stretched on for months, with Sheriff Bennett leading the effort to uncover the truth. The Hartley family's life had been upended by the events of that night, and the town of Meadowbrook remained uneasy, its quiet charm now tinged with a shadow of uncertainty. Clues emerged sporadically, each one adding a layer to the puzzle but failing to reveal the full picture. Several weeks into the investigation, Bennett received a report from a hiker who had ventured into the woods near the farmhouse. The hiker had stumbled upon what appeared to be a piece of torn fabric snagged on a tree branch, a fragment of dark, heavy cloth that matched the description of the button found near the barn. Tests confirmed the fabric was from a coat, but no match could be made to anyone in the town. Bennett expanded his search beyond Meadowbrook, reaching out to neighboring communities and law enforcement agencies, but the lead grew cold. The coat remained a piece of the puzzle with no owner to claim it. Meanwhile, Evelyn began to notice small, subtle changes around the farmhouse. Tools would be misplaced, lights left on when no one had been in the room, doors slightly ajar that had been locked. Each incident was minor, easy to dismiss as oversight or coincidence, but together they painted a picture of unease that refused to be ignored. Samuel, ever the pragmatist, insisted there was nothing to fear, that the rain and wind often played tricks, and the weight of the investigation had created an atmosphere of paranoia. But Evelyn and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still lingering, watching from the shadows. Then, one evening, Bennett received an anonymous letter in his office mailbox. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unremarkable, but the contents sent a chill through him. The letter described the events of that night in vivid detail, details that had not been shared publicly. It referenced the flickering light in the barn, the footprints near the door, and the faint sound of footsteps. It ended with a cryptic statement: "Sometimes the rain washes away what it shouldn't." Bennett tried to trace the letter's origin, but the effort led nowhere. No fingerprints, no identifying marks on the paper, no record of the envelope being purchased locally. The letter was a dead end, and yet it haunted him, its words echoing in his mind long after the investigation officially closed. As time passed, Meadowbrook began to heal, though the scars of that night remained. The Hartleys rebuilt their routine, finding solace in their work and each other. Clara graduated from high school, her dreams of leaving Meadowbrook as bright as ever. Evelyn continued to tend her floral shop, her flowers blooming despite the lingering weight of unanswered questions. Samuel's workshop remained a space of quiet productivity, though his hands sometimes faltered, the memory of the barn still fresh in his mind. And Sheriff Bennett, though he moved on to other cases, never forgot the night the rain seemed to carry more than just water. He often returned to the farmhouse, sitting in his car outside the barn, replaying the events and wondering if he had missed something, if the truth was hidden in the details he had dismissed or the clues he had failed to find. To this day, the events of that night remain a haunting mystery. The torn fabric, the button, the cryptic letter, all fragments of a story that refused to reveal itself fully. Was it simply a case of coincidence? Or was there something darker lurking in the shadows of Meadowbrook, something the rain had sought to conceal? Perhaps the answers lie in the barn, or the woods, or the quiet streets of the town. Perhaps they've been washed away by the rain, leaving only questions to linger. Or perhaps they'll surface one day, when least expected, bringing closure to a story that has held Meadowbrook in its grip for so long. But for now, as the rain continues to fall, the mystery of that night remains just that, a mystery. And as you listen, I wonder, what would you have seen if you had been there? What would you have heard? Would the rain have spoken to you, revealing the truth it holds? Or would it have kept its secrets, leaving you to ponder what lies just beyond the edge of understanding? Story 5. It was a rainy evening in the heart of Greenvale, a small, unassuming town tucked away in a valley, surrounded by dense, whispering woods. The rain came steadily, cloaking the cobblestone streets and weathered rooftops in a soothing mist. It was the kind of night that invited you to curl up indoors, to watch the raindrops race down the windowpane and let the world outside fade into quiet obscurity. Greenvale, a town where faces were familiar, doors were left unlocked, and gossip passed freely across white picket fences, seemed like the last place where anything out of the ordinary could happen. But that night, as the rain fell, it brought with it something the townsfolk would never forget. That night would become etched in whispers, unanswered questions, and uneasy dreams. What unfolded in Greenvale that evening remains a puzzle to this day. A story told through fragments, through the soft echo of footsteps on wet pavement, the faint flicker of a light left on too long, and the eerie realization that not everything can be explained. As you listen to the rain and let its rhythm settle your thoughts, I invite you to journey with me into the heart of Greenvale's greatest mystery. It was 1972, a time when life seemed simpler, slower, almost as if the world had chosen to pause and savor its moments. The town of Greenvale sat nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by rolling hills and towering oaks. It was the kind of place where time felt soft and forgiving, where days blended seamlessly into one another. Narrow cobblestone streets wound their way through the town center, lined with small brick buildings that had stood for generations. At night, the flickering glow of lamplights cast long, lazy shadows, while the rain added its gentle rhythm to the symphony of silence. Greenvale was a community bound by familiarity. Neighbors knew one another by name, and greetings were shared with genuine warmth. The local diner, perched on the corner of Main Street, was a hub of chatter and laughter, where secrets were traded over coffee and blueberry pie. But beneath this veneer of serenity, no one could have anticipated the events that were about to unfold. Among the town's residents was a young woman named Eleanor Reed, a quiet, introspective soul who worked as a librarian at Greenvale's small but cherished library. Eleanor, known for her kind smile and a penchant for losing herself in the pages of dusty novels, lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town. Her life, much like Greenvale itself, was unremarkable at first glance, yet filled with the subtle beauty of routine. Those who knew her spoke of her gentleness, her love for late-night walks, and her habit of humming softly as she went about her day. Then there was Arthur Willis, the town's sheriff. A steadfast figure of authority with a weathered face that bore the lines of years spent solving petty disputes and chasing mischievous teens. Arthur was a man of few words but carried an air of quiet confidence, earning the respect of the townsfolk. His dedication to the community was unwavering, yet even he could not have foreseen what the rain would bring that fateful evening. And finally, there was Harold Grayson, the town's unofficial historian and keeper of its stories. An elderly gentleman with spectacles perched on the edge of his nose and an encyclopedic knowledge of Greenvale's past. Harold often claimed that the town itself had its share of buried secrets, tales whispered by the wind and hidden in the crevices of its history. It was a seemingly ordinary day in Greenvale. Work was done, dinners were shared, and lights began to flicker off one by one. But as the rain fell harder, a single event would shatter the fragile calm of this little town. An event that no one saw coming, yet one that would leave an imprint on the lives of everyone who called Greenvale home. Something happened that night. Something the rain could not wash away. And as we unravel the story together, remember, every detail, every quiet moment, holds a piece of the truth. Eleanor Reed was the kind of person you might pass by on the street without a second glance, her unassuming presence blending seamlessly into the rhythm of Greenvale. A librarian by profession, she had a quiet elegance about her, always dressed in muted tones, her hair pinned neatly back, a book often tucked under her arm. Those who knew her described her as thoughtful, reserved, and meticulous. She had a way of listening that made people feel heard, even if she rarely shared much about herself. Her days followed a predictable cadence. She spent her mornings cataloging books, her afternoons guiding patrons through the dusty shelves of Greenvale's library, and her evenings walking home through the winding streets, rain or shine. On weekends, she would venture into the woods bordering the town, her leather-bound journal in hand, jotting down notes about the birds, the trees, and the fleeting moments of beauty she observed. It was on one such evening, March 15, 1972, that Eleanor's routine seemed to falter. The rain was heavier than usual, the streets unusually quiet. Witnesses reported seeing her leave the library at precisely 8:45 p.m., her umbrella tilted against the wind, her pace unhurried despite the weather. She paused briefly at the corner of Maple Street, as if contemplating something, before turning and disappearing into the rain. That was the last time anyone saw Eleanor Reed alive. Her absence wasn't noticed immediately. It wasn't unusual for Eleanor to keep to herself, and so when she failed to show up at the library the next morning, most assumed she had taken the day off. It wasn't until days later, when her employer stopped by her house to check on her, that the concern began to take root. The house was locked, the curtains drawn, and there was no sign of Eleanor anywhere. Her employer, a kindly older woman named Mabel Hart, knocked several times before reluctantly calling the sheriff. When Arthur Willis arrived, he found nothing out of place. The furniture was undisturbed, the bed sheets neatly folded, and the faint scent of chamomile lingering in the air. Arthur's search extended to the surrounding areas, but it was a passerby who made the first chilling discovery. A young boy playing near the woods stumbled across Eleanor's umbrella, partially buried in mud, its frame bent as though it had been discarded in haste. The sheriff quickly organized a search party, and as word spread through Greenvale, concern turned to unease. People whispered about the possibility of an accident, yet the circumstances felt oddly deliberate. When the rain finally stopped, the quiet town woke up to a chilling realization. Eleanor's disappearance was no ordinary case of someone losing their way. There were traces, a shoe print, faint and fragmented, a torn scrap of paper with an unreadable scrawl, and a smudge of something that looked suspiciously like blood on the underside of the umbrella. To the townsfolk, it felt like the rain had washed away the truth, leaving behind only a puzzle too cryptic to decipher. Arthur Willis, seasoned though he was, found himself grappling with questions that seemed to multiply with every clue unearthed. The investigation began in earnest, focusing first on Eleanor's habits and acquaintances. Interviews with colleagues and neighbors revealed little. Eleanor had no known enemies, no dramatic conflicts, no reason for anyone to wish her harm. Her journal, found neatly placed on her bedside table, contained cryptic observations about the woods and weather but nothing out of the ordinary. But then there was Harold Grayson, the town's historian, who made an unusual claim. He insisted that Eleanor had been visiting the library archives more frequently in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, researching events from decades past. Though many dismissed his comments as ramblings, Harold was adamant. Eleanor had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. As the investigation continued, other strange details began to emerge. The shoeprint found near the woods didn't match Eleanor's size, suggesting someone else had been there. A single gold earring was recovered from the mud, yet Eleanor had never been seen wearing jewelry. The torn scrap of paper was traced to an old book about local folklore, one that had been checked out by Eleanor just days before her disappearance. How could someone so ordinary disappear so completely? Was it a calculated act, or a simple mistake that spiraled into chaos? The people of Greenvale clung to these questions, unable to reconcile the image of the gentle librarian with the shadowy mystery that now surrounded her. Speculation ran wild. Some blamed the encroaching woods, others whispered of an unknown figure seen wandering the streets that night, while a few dared to suggest something more sinister at play. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, they seemed to form a picture that was at once incomplete and deeply unsettling. What had Eleanor Reed seen, learned, or encountered on that rainy evening? And why did it seem as though the truth was hiding just out of reach? Greenvale was a town accustomed to peace. Families here shared dinners at twilight, children played games by the woods without worry, and doors were left unlocked. But Eleanor Reed's disappearance had cast a long shadow, and the comforting routines that once defined this place gave way to an unnerving stillness. The streets felt emptier, the smiles of neighbors hesitant. It was as though a question hung in the air, one that no one dared to voice. Could someone in their midst be responsible? Eleanor's family, though not residents of Greenvale, arrived days after news of her disappearance spread. Her mother, Margaret Reed, carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms, yet the sorrow in her eyes was unmistakable. Her father, Thomas Reed, stood at her side, his hands trembling as he clutched a photograph of Eleanor, the same photograph he showed to anyone who passed by, asking the hauntingly simple question, "Have you seen my daughter?" As Margaret wandered the streets, searching for answers that seemed impossible to find, her quiet grief touched everyone she encountered. People whispered about her strength, her resolve to hold herself together even as the weight of the unknown threatened to break her. And yet, it was Thomas's silence that lingered in the minds of many. His stoic presence spoke of a pain too deep for words, a longing for answers that no one seemed able to provide. For the townsfolk, the disappearance brought fear, an unspoken realization that the safety they had taken for granted might no longer exist. Parents kept their children close, doors were locked for the first time in years, and conversations that once flowed freely were now laced with suspicion. Who could be trusted? Who might be hiding something? These questions began to shape the quiet chaos beneath Greenvale's serene facade. Among those closest to Eleanor, the emotions were tangled and raw. Mabel Hart, her employer at the library, spoke of the overwhelming guilt she felt. "I should have checked sooner," she told the sheriff, tears streaming down her face. "Maybe I could have done something." Harold Grayson, the town historian, seemed oddly withdrawn, though he muttered cryptic remarks about secrets buried in the past. Even Arthur Willis, the steadfast sheriff, admitted to feeling the weight of the town's collective fear. "Greenvale is different now," he confessed to a colleague. "It's like the rain didn't just wash away the clues, it washed away something in all of us." And then, of course, there were the theories. Greenvale, like any small town, had its share of speculation, each theory adding another layer to the mystery of Eleanor Reed. Some said it was a crime of passion, an argument gone too far, emotions flaring in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others believed it was a meticulously planned act of deception, pointing to the torn scrap of paper and the earring found near the woods as evidence that Eleanor's disappearance was no accident. There were those who suggested Eleanor's frequent trips to the archives had unearthed something dangerous. Perhaps she had stumbled across a truth someone wanted to remain hidden. Harold Grayson, in particular, seemed fixated on this idea, claiming that Eleanor had spoken to him about her research into Greenvale's history just days before she vanished. "She said she was close to understanding something," Harold insisted. "But she wouldn't tell me what." And yet, there were simpler theories too. Perhaps Eleanor had left of her own accord, choosing the anonymity of the rain to slip away from the life she had always known. Or perhaps an accident, tragic and unpreventable, had claimed her before anyone could intervene. The truth seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant, leaving everyone who heard her story to wonder, what really happened that night? If you were the detective, where would you start? Would you trust the evidence, the shoe print, the earring, the blood-stained umbrella? Or would you look deeper, into the lives of the people who knew her, searching for motives hidden behind smiles? As the rain falls tonight, perhaps you'll find yourself piecing together your own theories. But remember, every mystery holds truths that even the rain cannot wash away. Eleanor Reed's story is not just a tale of a disappearance. It's a reflection of the fragility of trust, the weight of unanswered questions, and the quiet fears that lie beneath the surface of ordinary lives. As we move forward, let's keep searching, not just for the truth, but for the humanity hidden in the shadows. The disappearance of Eleanor Reed remains one of Greenvale's deepest mysteries. In the weeks, months, and years that followed that fateful night, the town tried to move on. The streets returned to their familiar rhythms, and the rain continued to fall, as it always had. But for those who had been touched by Eleanor's story, a part of Greenvale would never feel quite the same. The investigation itself reached a standstill. Every lead, every promising clue seemed to dissolve under closer scrutiny. The torn scrap of paper, despite Harold Grayson's insistence, yielded no answers. The shoe print near the woods belonged to no one in Greenvale, its origin a question mark etched in the mud. And the gold earring, a detail so striking at first, was never claimed nor connected to Eleanor. Even the blood-stained umbrella, a chilling artifact of that night, could only offer the vaguest of conclusions. The rain had washed away too much. For Margaret and Thomas Reed, the unanswered questions were both a comfort and a torment. They returned to their lives, yet their days were colored by the absence of their daughter, a gap that could never truly be filled. Margaret often said, "It's as if she's still walking in the rain, just out of reach." And Thomas, though a man of few words, was seen more often gazing out at the sky, as if waiting for the storm to bring her back. The people of Greenvale, too, carried the weight of her story. Mabel Hart left the library some years later, saying she couldn't walk its quiet halls without thinking of Eleanor's kind smile. Arthur Willis retired, his confidence in his ability to protect his town shaken. And Harold Grayson's murmurs about secrets and truths faded with time, though to his last breath, he maintained that Eleanor had uncovered something significant, something lost to the rain. Perhaps the answers are lost forever, carried away with the rain, leaving only questions behind. The kind of questions that linger in the quiet moments, when the world feels still and the sound of raindrops fills the air. What happened to Eleanor Reed on that rainy night in Greenvale? Was it a moment of chance, an accident that spiraled out of control? Or was it something deliberate, a truth so buried that it could never be uncovered? As you listen to the rain now, I wonder how this story has settled within you. Do you find yourself imagining Eleanor's footsteps, tracing her path through the misty streets? Do you see the pieces of her life, the journal, the umbrella, the scattered clues, and piece them together in your mind, hoping to find what others could not? Or perhaps, you simply let the story rest, as the people of Greenvale eventually did, knowing that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. Eleanor's story is not just about a disappearance, it is about a community, a family, a town forever marked by the unknown. It is about the fragility of the lives we build, the secrets we keep, and the truths that slip away like water through our fingers. And in a way, it is also about the rain, the way it soothes, the way it washes, and the way it carries away what we thought we would always hold on to. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Eleanor's story and the rain-soaked streets of Greenvale. As you rest tonight, may the sound of the rain bring you peace, and may this tale accompany you into a world of dreams. Until next time, take care, and let the mystery linger just a little longer.